Okay, we still have some people signing on because we have a very big number, as I mentioned a moment ago. Let's go ahead and get started here because we don't want to shortchange the time. Our webinar today. See, a first question in our chat box is scheduled for an hour. The plan will be to have it all wrapped up within that time frame, and if there's any follow up, we can do so. So let's get started. Again, Happy New Year, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is a webinar called USPAP-Compliant Sample Evaluations, as well as an update on the standards and where the Standards Board is on this. My name is John Brenan. I am the Vice President of Appraisal Issues with the Appraisal Foundation. And joining me here today on this webinar is Wayne Miller, the Chair of the Appraisal Standards Board. Hello, Wayne.
Hello, John. Good morning, good afternoon, Happy New Year. It's a pleasure to be with you as always.
Great, thank you so much. And also joining us behind the scenes and doing all the heavy lifting is Aida Dedayach, who is the Program Manager for the Appraisal Standards Board. So we want to make sure to thank Aida for all her hard work as well. So with that, let's get started here. Again, a couple little housekeeping things. First of all, this webinar is being recorded and will be viewable on our YouTube channel in the event that for some reason you have to drop off for a portion, or if you're unable to do this at this particular time, you'll be able to go back and look it over. Or if you enjoy it so much and you just want to watch it multiple times, you can do that as well. One of the things that you will see at the conclusion of the webinar is a real brief survey. And we know how much everybody loves to do surveys, but we would appreciate you just taking a moment or two, because we really want these to be as meaningful and as effective as possible for you. So please take a moment and complete the survey at the conclusion of the webinar. I did mention earlier that time permitting, we will try to answer some of your questions, and we will do the best we can to get to those. And the way that you will do that is through our chat function. So if you have not yet got the chat box open on your screen, you can do it a couple of ways. You can move the mouse to the bottom of your screen, and a menu should appear with one of the options being the chat feature. Another easy way to do it is a keyboard shortcut that Alt-H, A-L-T, Alt-H, would give you the chat box as well. And you'll want to do that even if you don't want to ask any questions, because in that chat box, you'll be seeing things like links to the sample evaluations that we're going to be talking about today, as well as a PDF of today's presentation. So it behooves you to go ahead and open that chat box, even if you don't intend to ask any questions of us. So let's get into the meat of the webinar here today, which again, we're going to start with the USPAP-Compliant Evaluations. And going into our first slide here, Wayne, before we really start talking about evaluations, I think it's safe to say that not everyone on today's webinar may have the same familiarity. And when I say not everyone, I do want to point out that you are a record-breaking audience. We had just shy of 2,000 people register for this webinar. So we are extremely grateful, and we hope that we can provide this kind of information to groups of this size and make it very effective. But given that, Wayne, can you give a little bit of background that can set the stage for those that might not have that familiarity for this webinar?
Well, certainly, John. So, first off, evaluations are real property valuation assignments, and they are a construct of Title 11 of FIRREA. Evaluations are completed for federally regulated financial institutions when an appraisal may not be required to support a real estate secured transaction or credit decision. So this could be a new loan origination, it could be a renewal, could be a loan monitoring event, etc. It's a risk-based decision for the institution. So it's important to remember that the evaluation assignment result is the market value of real property. And this is done in accordance with the Federal Financial Institutions definition of market value. The definition and the elements of that definition are listed here in the PowerPoint, and include competitive and open market, buyer and seller each acting prudently and knowledgeably, and assuming the price is not affected by undue stimulus. Let me say, John, that the assumptions underlying this webinar are as follows. First off, we're assuming that the institution has determined that the transaction or credit decision being considered qualifies for an evaluation, and that an appraisal, which is viewed to be a higher level product, is not required. The second assumption is that the institution has decided to hire an appraiser who is obligated to complete the work in accordance with USPAP. So either the client requires it, or the requirements of state licensure law obligate the appraiser to perform in accordance with USPAP. And then thirdly, that the appraiser has determined that an evaluation which can convey credible assignment results can be completed on the property to be valued. As noted here, John, on the slide, the interagency appraisal and evaluation guidelines do provide guidance as to the minimum content to be reported. And then what folks should know is that the samples here are based on the minimum reporting requirements for a restricted appraisal report under Standards 2-2B, Standards Rule 2-2B of the 2020-21 USPAP.
Great, Wayne. Thank you for that background. So with that, let's move forward. And I guess really one of the most fundamental questions we can ask here, and I think we're not going to tip our hand, but you might guess what the answer is. Can evaluations be completed in compliance with USPAP?
Well, I'm happy to say, John, we've got another 51 minutes to talk. So the answer to that question is yes. Otherwise, we might as well hang up now. In fact, John, the ASB has previously provided guidance to stakeholders on this topic. Advisory Opinion 13, which is entitled Performing Evaluations of Real Property Collateral to Conform with USPAP, has been part of the USPAP related guidance for many years. And also in late 2017, you and I delivered a webinar on the topic of performing evaluations in compliance with USPAP. So, this is not really a new topic for the Appraisal Standards Board.
Yes, 2017, I recall it. It all seems familiar to me now. Thank you for that reminder. So let's talk about why. Since this is not a new topic, why has the ASB developed these USPAP compliant evaluation samples at this time?
Sure. Well, over the past year or so, market forces have brought about increasing de minimis threshold levels, particularly for new loan originations. So it's likely that a significant number of higher dollar, perhaps more complex properties may be valued via evaluations rather than appraisals. So as a result of this, state regulators, financial institutions, and appraisers have been wrestling with the topic of USPAP compliant evaluations completed by appraisers. And, in our ongoing effort to understand the relevant issues occurring in the profession, the ASB held a public hearing on the topic of evaluations this past October. And, the ASB regularly meets with our advisory councils and ARRO, which is the Association of Appraiser Regulatory Officials. As a result of the feedback from these stakeholders, the ASB felt there was great support for the development of sample evaluations.
Great. Okay, Wayne, you've explained why the ASB took this path and developed these sample evaluations. Now, can you tell us about the process the ASB went through to develop these samples?
Well, John, through its boards and councils, including the Board of Trustees, the Appraisal Foundation Advisory Council, the Industry Advisory Council, we have many contacts in the financial services industry. And as such, we reached out to folks and we asked them to share copies of evaluations that they typically order and or typically receive. Next, we studied the rules, standards, and guidance in USPAP, as well as the guidance contained in the interagency appraisal and evaluation guidelines regarding evaluation report content. And we then used, we have restricted appraisal report samples that we've had for the last few cycles. We've updated the 2020 version, it's posted on the website. And so we started with those samples, and then we layered in additional content items from the interagency appraisal and evaluation guidelines specific to evaluations. And then finally, John, we asked several market participants to review the samples that we created before we finalized them in preparation for this webinar. Along those lines, I do want to take a moment to express the gratitude of the ASB to those folks who did provide evaluation samples initially, as well as those folks who volunteered their time to review the drafts that we developed and provide suggestions. I can't acknowledge these folks by name as we agreed to keep their involvement confidential, but they should realize that their efforts are greatly appreciated. We believe that the end product here is better because of the assistance that they provided.
Great. Thank you for that acknowledgement. So, all right, we've talked about the background for doing this. We've talked about why the ASB did it and what the process was. Let's get into the nitty gritty. Wayne, let's talk about the actual samples.
Sure. Well, the ASB developed two samples, one involving a single unit residential property and one involving a non-residential property. And although we started this process late last year, it's important to note that the samples were developed to comply with the requirements of USPAP 2020-21, which just went into effect about 2 weeks ago on January 1st. Specifically, as I think I mentioned before, the samples are designed to comply with USPAP Standards Rule 2-2B on restricted appraisal report minimum content, as well as the guidelines contained in the interagency the guidance containing interagency guidelines for evaluation content. Another thing to note is that these samples are narrative in format. They don't necessarily follow a specific format or template used by a particular lending institution. In addition, it's important to remember, John, that individual states may require certain wording to be included in an evaluation. And everyone on the call here should be advised that these samples do not incorporate any state-specific language. As you can well imagine, we would have to go to every state, figure out what that language is, and provide some sort of drop-down menu if we were going to try to do that. So, as always, an appraiser should have an understanding of the specific requirements of the state in which they're practicing. And the last thing I'll offer as any good appraiser, a disclaimer here, the samples are not intended to be used as a template, only as an example of what is possible.
So that's great clarification, Wayne. So even though these evaluations are fully USPAP compliant when it comes to certain state or other requirements, as we know, your mileage may vary. You need to see exactly what's required there. Now, I noted that you indicated that the ASB used Standard Rule 2-2B for the restricted appraisal report minimum reporting content as a guide. Why did the ASB focus on 2-2B for a restricted appraisal report rather than 2-2A for an appraisal report's minimum reporting contents?
Well, John, that's an excellent question. Evaluation, keep in mind, an evaluation is typically used on lower risk, less complex properties where, a lesser presentation is deemed to be appropriate from a risk perspective. Again, this is a risk-based decision that an institution has made to use an evaluation. So, if we started with the appraisal report, big A, big R, minimum content as our base, we really wouldn't have needed to have this webinar. Frankly, we would just have sent an email to everyone that said, go do an appraisal. Now, that said, as we'll discuss shortly, there are some elements of evaluation minimum content guidance that exceed the minimum requirements in USPAP for a restricted appraisal report. However, by using the minimum requirements of T-2B as a base, the appraiser can state some of the necessary items rather than providing a lengthier summary of those items within the context of an evaluation.
Outstanding. Thank you, Wayne. So so let's start talking about the actual samples. The first one is for a single unit residential property. What can you tell us about the underlying elements that were looked at for that sample?
Well, as you noted, John, this sample involves the development of a market value of a single unit residential property. And, this is where we begin to mesh the requirements of USPAP with the content guidelines of the interagency appraisal and evaluation guidelines. As a restricted appraisal report, appraisers should keep in mind that it's a USPAP requirement that they have a work file which contains sufficient information for the appraiser to produce an appraisal report. Again, going back to our initial assumptions of this whole process, this is an appraiser who's seeking to comply with USPAP and provide an evaluation. So the USPAP rules for record keeping and ethics all apply here. Furthermore, since this is a restricted appraisal report, the appraiser is required to state that the report is restricted to use by the client or clients and any other named intended users. This is a new feature, actually, of USPAP 2020-21 for restricted appraisal reports. Previously, a restricted appraisal report was, in fact, restricted to use only by the client or co-clients. No other intended users were allowed. However, during our last round of changes to USPAP, we received stakeholder feedback, and the ASB amended USPAP to allow additional intended users if they are named and not simply identified by type. It's important to note here, John, that the interagency guidelines are more restrictive on this matter. Because the decision to use an evaluation product is unique to the risk management practices of a specific institution, the interagency group advises that, and this is a quote, an institution generally should not rely on an evaluation prepared by or for another financial services institution. Therefore, in deference to that guidance, we are, in these samples, the client is indicated to be the only intended user here. So continuing on down our list, as a restricted appraisal report, USPAP allows an appraiser to state most of the content. This is, we like to describe a restricted appraisal report as a primarily results-only type of report. However, the samples have incorporated the interagency guidance, requiring that in some cases, the appraiser describe some information rather than simply stating it. Under USPAP also, the appraiser needs to disclose the research and analyses performed, which could include disclosing analyses not performed. You have to state the methods and techniques used and the reasons for excluding the cost, income, or sales comparison approach. So in the case of the single unit residential sample, only the sales comparison approach was considered necessary to produce credible assignment results, and the sample itself states the reasons why the other approaches were not necessary. Lastly, in a restricted appraisal report, the appraiser is required to summarize the results of analyzing subject sales, agreements of sale, options, and listings.
Great, great. Thank you, Wayne.
Sure.
Moving on to the non-residential sample, in what ways does this differ from the residential sample?
Well, in this case, the most obvious way is that the non-residential sample is not of a single unit residential. It is, in fact, of a light industrial building as the subject. And furthermore, and I'm not going to read down this same list of all those items that pertain to the elements underlying the single unit residential, but in this case, in the non-residential sample, we decided to use an example of a property that is leased, subject to a lease. So in this case, the income approach was the most relevant approach to produce credible results. So, as outlined here on slide 12, the other required elements are the same with regard to the work file, disclosure of research analyses, reasons for excluding approaches, etc.
Great, great, thank you. Well, let's get into some of these excerpts, and we'll start here. And Wayne, although we're not going to go through each page and each section of both of the samples, let's start with an excerpt here from the residential sample.
Great. Each of the samples starts with a disclosure of the report type, a restricted appraisal report. It also includes the required limitation on use by only the client and other named intended users. Again, in this case, only the client is the intended user per the information in the interagency guidelines. And the samples also include the required warning language in USPAP that the report may not contain supporting rationale for all of the opinions and conclusions set forth in the report.
So great, that's supporting rationale. Can you, Wayne, give us an example of where the supporting rationale for an opinion or conclusion might not be contained in a restricted appraisal report?
Sure. When rendering market value, John, an appraiser has to consider the highest and best use of the property. So within a restricted appraisal report, an appraiser can simply state the property's highest and best use. So they've developed it, they've decided it's the highest and best use, and all they have to do is state it. So in such a case, the client is on notice that the supporting rationale for, in this case, the highest and best use conclusion may not be contained in the report.
Great, thank you.
Sure. Moving on to the next slide, John, 13. There are some, basic descriptive items to identify the property, including the address. And one thing I will mention here is, if one were valuing maybe a vacant parcel of land, rather than the address, which may not be relevant, might not even have an address, the appraiser might instead include information here that describes the property's location. I think the language actually used in the interagency guidelines is location. For most properties that are single buildings, simple properties that have an address, that may suffice. And it may also, the evaluation may also include plat maps or location maps, et cetera, and the addendum of the document, all of which would, specifically identify the subject of the evaluation. And then finally, as required by USPAP, the appraiser is required to identify the client and the intended use, of course, noting above the client is already identified as the only intended user.
Let's move on to the next excerpt from this residential sample.
Sure. Well, this excerpt notes some other required elements, including a statement of the highest and best use. We talked about that before. We've also got to have an estimate of reasonable exposure time, since we did render market value, and a disclosure of the effective date of the assignment results. As we noted before, the sales comparison approach was concluded to be the only approach necessary to produce credible assignment results. So, here we have an excerpt which includes the grid of sales information and a summary discussion of the sales, leading to a value indication via the sales comparison approach.
Great, great. How about talking a little bit about the non-residential sample? What's the same and what's different here?
Well, on this slide, John, the introductory information is largely the same. The difference, of course, is that the subject property is a one-story light industrial building. And then, let's see, moving on to slide 16, in this case, the subject property, as I think I noted before, is leased. So it's subject to a lease to a third-party tenant under a relatively long-term remaining. Thus, the income approach was applied in order to render credible assignment results. And what slide 16 does is it introduces the approach, includes some of the market data an appraiser might use in completing this approach. Quick note here on data sources. Some of the feedback we received from our external reviewers revolved around the disclosure of data sources. There's some discussion of that in the interagency guidelines. And with the exception of some references to MLS in single unit sample, the samples really refer to data sources somewhat generically. Depending upon the property and the location, there are a myriad of local, regional, national data sources an appraiser could use. And, it may be necessary or appropriate to specify these data sources in the scope of work section or in the report addendum. Just putting that out there. MLS is fairly ubiquitous in the residential world, and so we felt we were safe by sliding that in there. On slide 17, the sample includes information necessary to support the income approach, along with a pro forma operating statement and a calculated value via this approach.
Great, thank you. Can you tell us a little bit about what we're seeing here on slide 18, Wayne?
Sure. So this slide, John, includes a placeholder for assumptions and limiting conditions that an appraiser might wish to include. Most appraisers have a laundry list of assumptions, limiting conditions that they include in appraisal reports or restricted appraisal reports. Further, this page includes the certification language from USPAP Standards Rule 2-3A. And a couple things I'll point out here, the option to disclose an appraiser's interest, yes or no, or what it is, or either interest in the property or the parties has been eliminated. An appraiser has to be independent of such interest when completing an evaluation or appraisal for a federal financial institution. So we decided to go ahead and just remove those. The other options or disclosures were left in the analysis here. So the appraiser can disclose prior services, disclose whether they have or have not made a personal inspection, disclose whether any significant real property appraisal assistance was provided. And finally, on this page, there's a placeholder for addenda information. So farther up in the samples, we do reference photographs. So when we were talking about describing the property, there's a reference to, and go see the photographs. Well, we didn't actually take photographs of anything and put them in the samples, but here is where one might include photographs of the subject property, perhaps, other items in the addendum, location maps, a map of comparables, information on data sources. For the non-residential sample, maybe here we're putting in some historic financial data, and anything else that the appraiser determines is necessary so the client can understand the report results.
Great, thank you. And so those are some of the excerpts, and again, the links to the full evaluation samples you have been provided with. They are available on our website. You can look at those sample documents in their entirety. Having talked a little bit about those samples and the excerpts, let's turn now to what the Standards Board is looking at doing for potential changes for the future of USPAP. Now, we know that we know that the new USPAP has just been in effect for a little over 2 weeks, as you pointed out earlier, so we don't want people to think that the board is focused solely on what's next, but it is something, the way the board has to consider these changes so that there is time to fully vet and examine concepts and issues and receive feedback to be able to adequately consider these issues and then be able to address them in USPAP as you expect. So Wayne, with that little intro there, what is on the horizon for the ASB?
Well, certainly, John, and just to reiterate what you just indicated, we have just had USPAP 2020 go into effect. Coursework is out there in the marketplace and is available for folks to take to get an update on the changes for 2020. We certainly encourage folks to go do that. We've had instructors who have been recertified. We'll also have some instructor certification courses coming up for potential new instructors. So there's always something going on that once we approve changes, which I believe we did last April, a lot has to happen to make USPAP come to fruition and all of the parallel efforts that go along with that. That being said, because of the way that USPAP affects, stakeholders, we do have a long lead time. So, there are some items that we were unable to include in the 2020 version, either because of some unfinished business or some late breaking news. There were some other items that actually have come up since April that we have been considering. So we're always looking at ways to enhance USPAP to keep pace with the evolutionary changes in appraisal practice. So as promised, actually at our public meeting in October, we did issue a stakeholder survey in December, so a little over a month ago, within which we posed some questions regarding items that have emerged or continue to be relevant but have not yet been addressed. And a couple of the examples of items that are being discussed include a potential revisitation of the single reporting standard idea, addressing the topic of significant assistance by appraisers as well as others who provide information, and continuing to try to clarify definitions in USPAP. So those are just a taste of some of the items that have emerged. We also have received feedback from USPAP instructors who have begun to teach the 2020-21 USPAP update courses on these topics, as well as some other topics, items we may need to clarify, changes that folks may not completely understand at this point that may result in some FAQs going out. I would urge folks, if you did receive a stakeholder survey and you haven't filled it out yet, we certainly hope that you do so. We appreciate everyone's feedback. Because today's topic, John, is evaluations, I guess I can address, if you will, perhaps the elephant in the room. We did have a public hearing back in October, and the topic was evaluations and how USPAP views evaluations. And certainly that's been the topic of today's webinar. Some of the feedback we received is that some of the problem with evaluations in compliance with USPAP is a labeling issue. So we're looking pretty hard at the single reporting standard idea, because we believe that if it's possible to eliminate the label, then there may be a way for folks to complete evaluations, call them evaluations, and have them simply comply with USPAP by the content as opposed to by the label. So that's our current I don't know, tangential thought a little bit on, if you will, solving the evaluation challenge. What I'll mention is that, the folks who are on this call are likely heavily focused on real property valuation, and some of the feedback we received from personal property appraisers and business appraisers is that there are other types of valuation products that, if we're going to have a specialized set of standards for evaluations, that maybe it would be necessary to have specialized standards for those valuation products. That would become a bit challenging and might make USPAP unwieldy. So we think, again, by trying to get the single reporting standard idea right, that we may be able to solve the challenges that folks have experienced.
And Wayne, if I can jump in there for a second, so just to try to put a little bow on what you said there, one of the things that, for those of you that saw the concept paper and participated either by a live stream or otherwise in the public hearing that we talked about on this issue, one of the questions was that the board had put out: should there be new standards for evaluations in USPAP, like a standard 11 for developing evaluations and a standard 12 for the reporting of them. And so just to make it clear, what Wayne has said here is that's not really the tack that the ASB is looking at right now to address that. It's more this single set of minimum reporting requirements, as Wayne just provided in detail, that if that's done the way the ASB envisions, that it may address this evaluation issue without the need for additional standards. Is that a fair summation, Wayne?
It is. And, honestly, John, over the next month or so, we're going to put out a first exposure draft of potential changes for 2022. And we certainly want everyone to provide their feedback. Again, we had the single reporting standard in the prior set of potential changes until we got toward the end and we realized there were some potential unintended consequences of that. We'd like to get ahead of that early on here so that we understand if that's a viable direction to go in. And we'll be seeking the commentary of stakeholders in general, but also in particular, some of our boards and councils, who obviously are clients and providers of appraisal services. So we're hoping to hear those public comments in writing, as well as at our in-person meeting coming up in San Antonio in early April.
Right, and just to underscore that, as you see on this slide here, and I'm going to say this because we say this during every webinar, and we say this at every place we speak and every time we meet. As practitioners, as users of appraisal services as well, the standards that are adopted by the ASB give very, very strong consideration to the public comment that is received. And if you want to have input into how those standards are developed, please send in your comments. And I will say this because as someone who for many years now has sat in the room with the Standards Board as well as our Qualifications Board, each one of these letters, each one of these comments is read, reviewed, discussed by the board members. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter what organization you belong to or what organization you may not belong to. It is about your concept and the rationale for your concept. So please forgive me for taking a moment there to get up on my soapbox, but as an appraiser, I think you should definitely want to comment on these standards, even if your comment is, this is a great idea, we like it, I have nothing else to add, or it's a terrible idea and here's why, and maybe you should think about something else. Please provide your feedback. So with that, let's try to answer a few of these questions. Now, I know we have a lot of the questions that have showed up in the chat box here, so I'm going to try to navigate these as we go through. Some of these are not exactly on point for the Standards Board, and we may not be able to really provide an answer to them right now, but we will do the best we can with what we've got. First question here, Wayne, it says the interagency guidelines also outline criteria for validations, such as physical condition, market conditions, deterioration, etc. Would validations of a prior value be construed as an opinion of value and in turn require USPAP compliance?
Well, a validation, if the end result is that the value of the property is the same as it was that I previously provided to you in a prior report, then yes, that is an updated appraisal that relies upon information in the prior appraisal.
Exactly. And the second part of that require USPAP compliance. Again, what we've tried to explain here is that evaluations in and of themselves for federally regulated financial institutions do not necessarily require USPAP compliance. But if you are required to comply with USPAP or you wish to comply with USPAP, then that validation that Wayne just spoke of would need to follow USPAP as well. And advisory opinion 3, update of a prior appraisal, would be a good place for you to look there. There's a question that says, if a lender asks for an evaluation and you say you can do it, and you prepare one that is USPAP compliant, just as we have talked about here on this webinar, but you're now delivering a restricted appraisal report, is that okay? If the scope of work does not necessarily match what was requested, is it okay for you to be asked to do an evaluation, but you actually submit an appraisal?
Well, I think, you know, in any case, communication with your client is important. So if a client called you and asked you to do something that you felt that you could do, it would be best, you know, certainly a best practice to have an understanding of what you were going to do, what you were not going to do, how it was going to read. If you have a concern that your client is going to want something different than what you're going to prepare, something additional, that's fine. You should know that up front. If your client wants something less than you are able to prepare, then you need to have a serious discussion with your client about your ability or lack thereof to do that. You know, that's not so much USPAP advice. That's sort of, you know, business advice, but understand what your client wants and needs. Do what you can to deliver it. But if you are compelled by state law, or again, you're agreeing with the client to perform in accordance with USPAP, then there are certain minimum thresholds that you have to meet.
Thank you, Wayne. Another question here, and it's a great question. We may have a rather short answer, we may not. The question is, are we aware of any published comprehensive guidance for users or providers of evaluations as to the legality of non-appraiser evaluations under the 50 states' varying laws?
My short answer to that is no.
And I would concur. And one of the things that was talked about in the concept paper is that in fact, the requirements for, and I'm going to say requirements with air quotes here, for evaluations technically are in the form of the, as we've talked about on this webinar, the Interagency Appraisal and Evaluation Guidelines, which are technically guidance. And there have been some court rulings that say that guidance is just that, guidance, and may not be enforced. So a lot of that ties into exactly what some of the concerns are about not only appraisers performing evaluations, but non-appraisers, just was asked in the question. There's a question that regarding the stakeholder survey that you referenced, Wayne. It said, what perspective did the entities surveyed bring? Were they commercial, residential appraisers? Was it bank-held loans, secondary market loans? Is there anything you can illuminate there?
On the stakeholder surveys?
Correct.
You know, we endeavor to get a cross-section of individuals. So as an example, the survey may have gone out to certified USPAP instructors, which sort of run the gamut from those who instruct full-time to those who may be bank appraisers and also teach. They may be residentially focused. They may be commercially focused. You know, our goal is to receive as broad-based a set of comments as possible, rather than simply focusing on one segment of the market.
Great, thank you. Here's another question that we get, and what we talked about here in the webinar did kind of explain this, but there's a specific question, and I think you'll be able to give a pretty clear answer. The question is, can evaluations be used for other types of assignments, such as probate?
Well, you know, the sort of our first slide addresses what an evaluation is. I'll say in the context of this webinar. You know, evaluation is a word that is in the dictionary, you know, that may or may not have anything to do with the valuation of real property. But evaluation in the context of the interagency appraisal and evaluation guidelines is a specific valuation product that has a specific purpose. Consequently, you know, using it for some other purpose may or may not meet the needs of the client that you're attempting to serve.
Right, exactly. I think that's the important message we want to get across is this term and this product, evaluation, as we said earlier and as Wayne just underscored again, is a creation of the federal financial regulatory agencies. It's something other than an appraisal. So in their minds, there is an appraisal and there's an evaluation. So when you go outside of that federal financial regulatory world, there are, you know, it's not necessarily an evaluation. It may be an appraisal. It may have different scope of work and different reporting requirements, but you're still talking about some level of appraisal. And again, the definitions for some of these things may appear in your state law as to what is considered an appraisal and what is not. So you might want to check on your state there. There's a question here that says, is it true that state law determines whether or not an evaluation completed by a state credentialed appraiser must comply with USPAP?
Well, while I am not on the state board of every state, or even my own state, you know, clearly the state determines and regulates commerce within its boundaries. So if the rendering of in this case, market value opinion, you know, by a professional falls into their definition of an appraisal, then it's an appraisal, and it is, if the expectation within that state is that anyone who's completing an appraisal be credentialed as a licensed or certified appraiser, then yes. You know, it's interesting that there are products where the answer is price or value, where others are able to render those. You know, there are carve-outs in many states for brokers who do certain work. That, you know, that's beyond the purview certainly of USPAP, and it's up to the individual states to decide.
Right, thank you. And as I mentioned, the state can very often defines what an appraisal is in terms of an opinion of value or some other definition. There's a question here that says, if a work file has to be sufficient to produce an appraisal report, would it be safe to say that an appraiser can provide an evaluation report but must comply with the development requirements under Standard 1?
Well, if an appraiser is providing an evaluation that, as we've defined it, is presented in at a minimum, a restricted appraisal report presentation, then the baseline assumption is yes, they have developed it in accordance with Standard 1. as well as the other rules that precede and the definitions and everything that comes before Standard 1 in USPAP.
Great, thank you, Wayne. And again, we've really just roughly touched on this, but there's a question that says, are there any requirements regarding who can perform evaluations?
Well, there is guidance in the interagency appraisal and evaluation guidelines that sets forth suggestions on who might perform evaluations. The topic of this discussion, to be quite honest, is not sort of filtering that, deciding whether that's a good list or a bad list. I can say that appraisers are on that list and are considered individuals who could certainly provide evaluations. But while a specific institution may have a list of who they want to use, there's no comprehensive list that would be national in scope that would indicate who can and who can't. Again, state law may dictate that. There could be very narrowly defined state laws that basically say, if you're performing an evaluation, you have to be a state credentialed appraiser. And if so, then there's your answer.
Thank you. There's another question, and we did address this briefly on as well as on one of the slides. Is the lender's decision to order an evaluation rather than an appraisal strictly a subjective determination? Is it pretty much up to them entirely?
Well, this is where it gets a little deep. An evaluation being a construct of Title 11 of FIREA makes this whole discussion one of prudent management of an institution's real estate portfolio, right? So the guidelines are in fact guidance that is provided to financial institutions for the development and maintenance of their appraisal and evaluation, ordering and review process. So, I mean, those are the elements that live behind the choice to seek a valuation of any sort to support a credit decision with regard to mortgage lending, extension of further credit, monitoring, all of those elements. So what an organization, an institution has to be able to do is demonstrate to their regulator that they have a prudent process in place for the making loans and monitoring their lending portfolio. So there are thresholds. There are, we talked about the de minimis level, right? So when a new loan transaction exceeds the de minimis, there's a hard rule that says you must have an appraisal, not an evaluation. And depending upon the type of loan that it is, that de minimis level can be different. Beyond that, when we're talking about monitoring, subsequent credit decisions, et cetera, what the institution has to do is have a policy in place, policy or policies in place that that defines for them when they can order an evaluation or whether they must order an appraisal. So the short answer is yes, it's somewhat subjective as long as they can demonstrate that they are being prudent and that the safety and soundness of their real estate portfolio is not negatively impacted by ordering evaluations. The longer answer I already gave.
Great, thank you. We've got time for just a couple of more questions. In the interim here, I do want to put this slide up that has our contact information while we do try to address these last couple of questions. One question says, our example of the residential evaluation sample, in the sales comparison approach, it did not include any adjustments. However, in an appraisal report, adjustments may have been warranted. Is showing adjustments not required for an evaluation?
Well, and you know, we looked at the guidance that is provided, and there were no specific items that said you must show adjustments in the event that you provide a sales comparison approach. So in that case, we did not provide specific adjustments. You know, we've all, I mean, many folks have certainly seen a 10004 or other residential form report, which includes adjustments. You know, if your client is asking you to utilize a certain format, they may or may not request or require that you provide specific adjustments.
Great. And this question here, probably again a fairly short answer, but I will not answer it for you. Wayne, have any of the federal agencies, and I assume we're talking about the federal banking regulatory agencies, asked the Standards Board to provide guidance or standards for evaluations? Have they given any indication that they would require evaluations to follow ASB standards?
No, the short answer is no. This was, again, I think I mentioned in the last webinar that we did that this is all on us. You know, we got questions from states, appraisers, some financial institutions about this topic, and consequently we decided to go take the pulse of the marketplace via our public hearing. And you know, what resulted from that is a desire for samples that comply, and so that's where we find ourselves today.
Okay, great. And this will be our last question for the session. Does an appraiser need to maintain a work file for an evaluation assignment?
If an appraiser is compelled to complete their work in compliance with USPAP, then they're doing an appraisal or a restricted appraisal, and then the answer is yes, the work file requirements apply.
Great, great.
John, before we go, I do have one item, since we do have a rather large audience that I'm going to throw out there, and that is there's been a little confusion about the change to the definition of appraiser in the 2020-21 USPAP. And I just want to clear something up really quickly again, since we have a fairly large audience. The elimination of the comment was really just the elimination of the duplication of information that lives in the preamble. When we eliminated the comment that talked about basically you're an appraiser because you are compelled by their client, compelled by state law or some other regulation, or you've chosen to be an appraiser. That hasn't changed. That lives in the preamble. It was viewed as somewhat redundant, and our goal was to make USPAP a little bit easier to read by eliminating duplication. I think there's been an undercurrent out there that that perhaps by eliminating that comment, we've now opened up the definition of appraiser to encompass anyone that has anything to do with the greater valuation of property, and that is not the intent of the ASB.
Wayne, thank you for that important clarification. With that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time today. We appreciate, and again, please take a moment to complete the survey at the, as this webinar signs off. We want to make these as effective as possible for you. Wayne, thank you for your work today. And also, again, want to thank Aida Didayach and everyone for taking their time. Everyone have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Bye-bye.